August 5, 1964, Lieutenant Everett Alvarez Jr. watched his A-4 Skyhawk's engine flame out at 500 feet above the Gulf of Tonkin. The 26-year-old Navy pilot had seconds to eject before his aircraft spiraled into the water below. What he didn't know was that he'd just become America's first Vietnam War prisoner. This wasn't supposed to happen. Alvarez was flying a retaliatory strike against North Vietnamese torpedo boats after they'd allegedly attacked American destroyers. But as his parachute deployed and he drifted toward enemy territory, one thought consumed him. How long would this last? The answer would test every limit of human endurance. 3,113 days of torture, isolation, and psychological warfare lay ahead. What followed would break some men and forge others into legends. Everett Alvarez Jr. wasn't supposed to end up in a cockpit. Born in 1937 in Salinas, California, he was the son of Mexican-American farm workers who spent their days bent over lettuce fields under the scorching sun. His father, Everett Sr., had immigrated from Mexico with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable work ethic. The Alvarez family lived in a small house on the wrong side of town where dreams of flying Navy jets seemed as distant as the moon. But young Everett had something his circumstances couldn't crush, ambition that burned hotter than the California heat. While his classmates planned to follow their parents into the fields, Alvarez set his sights on something nobody in his family had ever achieved: college. He wasn't just the first in his family to graduate high school. He was determined to break every barrier that poverty and prejudice had built around him. The Naval Academy became his obsession. In the late 1950s, Mexican Americans weren't exactly welcomed with open arms at Annapolis, but Alvarez didn't care about the odds. He studied until his eyes burned, worked multiple jobs to support his application, and refused to let anyone tell him he didn't belong. When that acceptance letter arrived in 1958, it might as well have been a golden ticket. Everett Alvarez Jr. was going to become a naval officer. Annapolis was brutal. The hazing, the academic pressure, the constant reminder that he was different, it all could have broken him. Instead, it forged him into something harder. His classmates learned to respect the quiet farm worker's son who outworked everyone and never complained. But it was flight school where Alvarez truly found his calling. The moment he climbed into that cockpit, everything clicked. The kid who'd grown up watching crop dusters became a natural pilot. His instructors noted his precision, his calm under pressure, his ability to handle an aircraft like he'd been born to fly. By 1962, Lieutenant Alvarez had earned his wings and his dream assignment: carrier aviation. There's no feeling quite like launching off a carrier deck at full throttle, and Alvarez lived for that rush. He was young, talented, and absolutely convinced he was serving a righteous cause. The USS Constellation became his home. This wasn't just a job for Alvarez, it was a mission. He believed in what America was doing in Vietnam, believed in stopping the spread of communism, believed that his skills could make a difference in a complex war. His fellow pilots respected him. Here was a guy who'd clawed his way up from nothing, who flew with precision and never showed fear. At 26, Alvarez had everything he'd ever wanted: respect, purpose, and the wings of a naval aviator. As tensions escalated in Southeast Asia, Alvarez watched the political situation with the keen interest of someone who knew he'd soon be in the thick of it. The Gulf of Tonkin was heating up. American destroyers were reporting attacks by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. President Johnson was under pressure to respond with force. For pilots like Alvarez, this meant one thing: combat missions were coming. He'd trained for this moment his entire career. The farm worker's son who'd defied every expectation was about to fly into history. But history has a way of crushing even the most prepared men. And on August 5, 1964, Everett Alvarez Jr. would discover that all his training, all his ambition, all his dreams of glory meant nothing against the brutal reality of war. He was about to become the first American to learn what 8.5 years in hell really meant. The waters of the Gulf of Tonkin had been a powder keg waiting to explode for months. By August 1964, American destroyers were conducting intelligence-gathering missions in international waters, while North Vietnamese patrol boats prowled the coastline like hungry sharks. The first spark came on August 2nd. The USS Maddox, a destroyer bristling with electronic surveillance equipment, was conducting a routine patrol when 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats approached at high speed. What happened next depends on who you ask, but the result was clear. Shots were fired, and the North Vietnamese boats retreated with damage. President Lyndon Johnson faced a decision that would define his presidency. The military was pushing for retaliation, the public was demanding action, and Johnson, who'd inherited this Southeast Asian mess from Kennedy, knew that appearing weak wasn't an option in an election year. But Johnson needed more than one incident to justify military action. He got it 2 days later, or at least he thought he did. August 4th brought reports of a second attack on American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. The USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy claimed they were under assault by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in international waters. Radar contacts, sonar readings, and frantic radio chatter painted a picture of a coordinated enemy attack. Years later, we'd learn the truth. That second attack probably never happened. Nervous sailors, faulty equipment, and the fog of war had created a phantom battle. But in August 1964, Johnson had the justification he needed. Operation Pierce. Arrow was born in the White House Situation Room within hours. The plan was simple and devastating. Launch massive airstrikes against North Vietnamese naval facilities. Show the communists that America wouldn't tolerate attacks on its ships. Send a message that would echo across Southeast Asia. The target list was precise and calculated for maximum impact. The Han Gai torpedo boat base, where those patrol boats were stationed. The Loc Chow Naval Base, fuel storage facilities that kept the North Vietnamese Navy operational. These weren't random targets. They were surgical strikes designed to cripple North Vietnam's coastal operations. For the pilots selected for Pierce Arrow, this was the moment they'd trained for. Real combat, real targets, real consequences. The mission briefings were intense, focused, and filled with the kind of detail that meant the difference between success and disaster. Lieutenant Everett Alvarez Jr. sat in that briefing room aboard the USS Constellation, studying reconnaissance photos and memorizing target coordinates. His mission was clear. Destroy the torpedo boat facilities at Han Gai. Get in fast, hit hard, and get out before the enemy could respond effectively. The intelligence reports painted a picture of moderate defenses, some anti-aircraft guns, maybe a few surface-to-air missiles, but nothing a skilled pilot couldn't handle. The North Vietnamese weren't supposed to have sophisticated air defense systems. This should be a straightforward strike mission. Alvarez felt that familiar pre-mission tension. His hands were steady, his mind focused, but adrenaline was already starting to course through his veins. This wasn't training anymore. Those bombs under his A-4 Skyhawk were real. The targets below would shoot back with deadly intent. The morning of August 5th dawned clear over the South China Sea. Perfect flying weather. The USS Constellation turned into the wind, and the familiar controlled chaos of flight operations began. Deck crews scrambled around aircraft, making final checks and arming weapon systems. Alvarez ran through his pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision. Engine systems, navigation equipment, weapons status, everything had to be perfect. One malfunction over enemy territory could mean the difference between coming home and becoming a casualty statistic. The catapult launch felt like being shot from a cannon, as it always did. One moment he was sitting still on the deck, the next he was screaming through the air at 150 knots. The A-4 Skyhawk climbed steadily as Alvarez formed up with his wingman and headed toward the Vietnamese coast. The flight to target took less than an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. Below, The blue waters of the Gulf of Tonkin stretched endlessly. Ahead, the coastline of North Vietnam grew larger with each passing minute. Radio chatter was minimal, pilots saving their words for when they'd really need them. As they approached Hanggae, Alvarez could see the Ude torpedo boat base spread out below like a detailed map. Concrete piers, fuel tanks, administrative buildings, and several patrol boats tied up at the docks. It looked exactly like the reconnaissance photos, which was both reassuring and somehow ominous. The attack run began at 12,000 feet. Alvarez rolled his Skyhawk into a steep dive, the target growing larger in his windscreen with each second. The anti-aircraft fire started immediately, black puffs of smoke exploding around his aircraft as North Vietnamese gunners tried to track his descent. Then, everything went wrong. The surface-to-air missile came out of nowhere. Intelligence had been wrong about the air defenses. The North Vietnamese had more sophisticated weapons than anyone had expected. The missile didn't hit Alvarez directly, but the explosion was close enough to send shrapnel tearing through his engine. Warning lights flooded his cockpit. Engine temperature spiked into the red. Oil pressure dropped to zero. The steady roar of his jet engine became an irregular coughing, then silence. At 500 feet above the water, Lieutenant Everett Alvarez Jr. had about 10 seconds to make the most important decision of his life. Eject now, or try to nurse the crippled aircraft back to the carrier. He chose to eject. The parachute opened with a violent jerk that slammed Alvarez against his harness. Below him, the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin rushed up faster than he'd expected. He had maybe 30 seconds to prepare for what came next, and 30 seconds wasn't nearly enough time to process the reality of his situation. He hit the water hard. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent him plunging beneath the surface in a tangle of parachute lines and survival gear. For a terrifying moment, Alvarez thought he might drown before the enemy even got their hands on him. But his survival training kicked in, and he fought his way to the surface, gasping and struggling to free himself from the chute. The silence was deafening. No roar of jet engines, no radio chatter from his wingman, no familiar sounds of naval aviation. Just the gentle lapping of waves and the distant rumble of boat engines growing steadily louder. 3 North Vietnamese patrol boats were racing toward him, their crews visible on deck with weapons drawn. Alvarez treaded water and watched his captors approach, knowing that everything he'd been taught about survival as a prisoner of war was about to be put to the ultimate test. The sailors who hauled him from the water weren't gentle. Rough hands grabbed his flight suit and dragged him over the gunwale like a sack of grain. He was soaked, exhausted, and surrounded by men who spoke a language he didn't understand, but whose anger needed no translation. They bound his hands behind his back with rope that cut into his wrists. One sailor, apparently the boat commander, stood over him and shouted questions in Vietnamese. When Alvarez could only respond with his name, rank, and serial number, as required by the Geneva Convention, the questioning became more aggressive. The boat ride to shore felt like it lasted forever. Alvarez sat in the bottom of the patrol boat, water pooling around him, trying to process what had just happened. An hour ago, he'd been a naval aviator flying a combat mission. Now, he was a prisoner of war in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. The harbor at Hanggae was bustling with activity. Word had spread quickly that an American pilot had been shot down, and curious civilians lined the docks to get a look at their enemy. The crowd's mood was ugly. These people had just been bombed by American aircraft, and here was one of the pilots responsible. Alvarez was hauled off the boat and immediately surrounded by an angry mob. Fists flew. Someone hit him in the face with something hard, maybe a rock, maybe a tool. Blood ran down his cheek as hands grabbed at his flight suit and hair. For a moment, he thought the crowd might tear him apart right there on the dock. But the soldiers had other plans. They pushed through the crowd, using rifle butts to clear a path, and shoved Alvarez into the back of a military truck. The ride inland was a blur of shouting civilians, unfamiliar countryside, and the growing realization that he was completely at the mercy of people who had every reason to hate him. Hanoi was unlike anything Alvarez had ever seen. The streets were crowded with bicycles, pedestrians, and military vehicles. Buildings showed the wear of a country that had been at war for decades, and everywhere there were propaganda posters showing heroic Vietnamese fighters defeating American invaders. The truck stopped in front of a massive stone building that looked like it belonged in colonial France, which, Alvarez would later learn, it did. This was Ho Lo Prison, built by the French in the 1890s to house Vietnamese political prisoners. The Vietnamese had a bitter sense of irony in using it to hold American POWs. The Americans would call it the Hanoi Hilton, but there was nothing luxurious about the place. The walls were thick stone, the windows were barred, and the atmosphere reeked of decades of human suffering. As Alvarez was dragged through the main gate, he caught a glimpse of the sign above the entrance. He couldn't read Vietnamese, but he didn't need to. This was clearly a place where hope came to die. The initial processing was methodical and humiliating. Guards stripped him of his flight suit, his boots, his watch, everything that connected him to his former life. They gave him a set of prison pajamas that were too small and too thin for the climate. Then came the photographs, the fingerprinting, and the first taste of what would become a daily routine of degradation. The interrogation room was small, windowless, and lit by a single bare bulb. Alvarez sat on a wooden stool while 3 Vietnamese officers studied a file that seemed surprisingly thick for someone who'd been captured just hours earlier. They knew his name, his rank, his squadron, even details about his family back in California. The lead interrogator spoke English with a French accent, a legacy of Vietnam's colonial past. His questions started simple. Confirm your identity, describe your mission, explain American military tactics. Alvarez stuck to name, rank, and serial number, just as he'd been trained. That's when they told him something that hit him like a physical blow. He was the first American pilot shot down over North Vietnam, the first POW of what everyone hoped would be a limited conflict, the first to test whether American military training could withstand whatever the North Vietnamese had planned. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Alvarez had expected to be one prisoner among many, part of a group that could support each other through captivity. Instead, he was completely alone, facing an unknown future with no idea when, or if, other Americans would join him. The interrogators sensed his shock and pressed their advantage. They showed him propaganda leaflets describing American war crimes in South Vietnam. They read him statements from American anti-war protesters. They painted a picture of a conflict that his own country was already abandoning, but perhaps the cruelest blow was their prediction of how long he'd be their guest. The war would be over soon, they claimed, with North Vietnamese victory inevitable. American public opinion would force a withdrawal within months. He'd be home by Christmas, if he cooperated. Alvarez had no way of knowing that he'd just heard the first of thousands of lies he'd be told over the next 8.5 years. The interrogation ended with him being dragged to a cell that would become his world, 6 feet by 8 feet, with a concrete sleeping platform, a waste bucket, and walls that seemed to press in from all sides. As the heavy door slammed shut and the lock turned with finality, Lieutenant Everett Alvarez Jr. faced the first night of what would become the longest captivity endured by any American prisoner of war. Outside his cell, guards settled into their routine. Inside, a 26-year-old pilot began the mental battle that would define the rest of his life. The silence was complete. No friendly voices, no familiar sounds, no connection to the world he'd known just 12 hours earlier. In that darkness, Alvarez had no idea that his ordeal was just beginning. The first week, Alvarez thought he could outlast them. He'd been trained for this at survival school, resist interrogation, maintain military bearing, wait for rescue or release. But survival school lasted days, not months. And the instructors at survival school weren't trying to break your mind. The North Vietnamese had been perfecting their methods for decades. They'd learned from the French, who'd tortured Vietnamese independence fighters in these same cells. They'd studied Soviet techniques, Chinese communist practices, and developed their own brutal innovations. By the time Alvarez arrived, they had torture down to a science. It started with the rope torture, a technique so simple and so devastating that it would haunt American POWs for years. The guards would bind a prisoner's arms behind his back with rough hemp rope, then gradually tighten the bindings until circulation was cut off and the shoulders were forced into unnatural positions. They came for Alvarez on his 10th day in captivity. 4 guards entered his cell before dawn, when his resistance was lowest and his mind was foggy from interrupted sleep. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their intentions were clear from the coils of rope they carried. The binding process was methodical. They forced his arms behind his back, wrapping the rope around his wrists until it cut into the skin. Then came the innovation that made this torture so effective. They ran the rope up his back and around his neck, creating a system where any movement would tighten the noose while simultaneously wrenching his shoulders. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, his hands were numb from lack of circulation. His shoulders screamed as they were forced backward at an angle that human joints weren't designed to handle. And the rope around his neck meant that any attempt to relieve the pressure on his arms would strangle him. But the physical pain was just the beginning. The psychological torture was far more sophisticated. They left him bound like that for hours, sometimes days. Guards would check on him periodically, loosening the ropes just enough to prevent permanent damage, then retightening them when circulation returned. The cycle of relief and renewed agony was designed to break down his mental defenses more effectively than constant pain ever could. During these sessions, interrogators would visit his cell with offers. Confess to war crimes, and the ropes come off. Denounce American imperialism, and you get food. Write a letter condemning your government's policies, and the torture stops. The offers were always reasonable sounding, always presented as simple solutions to unbearable suffering. Alvarez held out longer than most men would have. His farm worker heritage had given him a tolerance for physical discomfort that served him well. But more importantly, his military training had instilled a code of honor that he wasn't ready to abandon, no matter what they did to his body. Sleep deprivation became another weapon in their arsenal. Just as Alvarez would drift off to sleep, guards would bang on his cell door with metal rods. The sound was deafening in the small space, designed to jolt him awake and keep his nervous system in a constant state of alert. They'd shine bright lights through the door slot, blast propaganda music, or simply scream at him in Vietnamese. The goal wasn't just to prevent sleep, it was to break down his cognitive abilities. Sleep-deprived prisoners couldn't think clearly, couldn't maintain their resistance, couldn't distinguish reality from hallucination. After weeks of interrupted sleep, Alvarez found himself agreeing with statements he would never have accepted in a normal state of mind. Starvation was perhaps the cruelest weapon of all. The daily food ration consisted of thin soup made from vegetable scraps, a small portion of rice that was often moldy or filled with insects, and occasionally a piece of bread that was more sawdust than wheat. The portions were calculated to keep prisoners alive but constantly hungry. Alvarez lost weight rapidly. His flight suit, already loose after the initial weight loss from stress, began hanging off his frame like a scarecrow's clothes. His ribs became visible, his face gaunt, his body consuming its own muscle tissue to survive. The constant hunger became an obsession, dominating his thoughts and weakening his ability to resist interrogation. The guards used food as a reward system. Cooperate with interrogators, and you might get an extra portion of rice. Refuse to answer questions, and you miss meals entirely. They would bring him better food, real meat, fresh vegetables, even fruit, and place it just outside his cell where he could smell it, but not reach it. Then they'd eat it slowly in front of him, describing how delicious it was. The attitude adjustment sessions took place in special rooms designed for maximum psychological impact. These weren't the crude torture chambers you might imagine, but sterile clinical spaces that felt more like operating rooms. The walls were painted white, the lighting was harsh and unforgiving, and the temperature was kept uncomfortably cold. In these rooms, torture became a performance. Multiple interrogators would work in shifts, keeping Alvarez off balance and preventing him from building rapport with any single captor. They used good cop, bad cop routines that would have been laughable if they weren't so effective on a sleep-deprived, malnourished prisoner. One interrogator would scream at him for hours, threatening execution and describing in graphic detail what they would do to his family if they ever got their hands on them. Then, a different officer would enter, apologize for his colleague's behavior, and offer sympathy and understanding. This reasonable interrogator would bring tea, speak softly, and present cooperation as the logical choice for an intelligent man. The psychological manipulation extended to every aspect of his captivity. Letters from home were withheld for months, then suddenly delivered in batches designed to maximize emotional impact. His wife's letters, describing her struggle to maintain hope for his return, were edited to remove encouraging passages and emphasize her growing despair. They showed him fabricated news reports claiming that the American public had turned against the war, that his fellow pilots were refusing to fly missions, that his own government had declared him dead and forgotten. Mixed in with these lies were enough real news stories to make the propaganda seem credible. Alvarez's early attempts at resistance only brought more severe punishment. When he refused to bow to guards, they forced him to stand at attention for 18 hours straight. When he wouldn't sign a confession, they suspended him from the ceiling by his bound arms until he passed out from pain. When he tried to communicate with other prisoners by tapping on walls, they moved him to solitary confinement in a cell so small he couldn't fully extend his arms. Each act of defiance was met with escalating brutality, designed not just to punish him, but to break his will to resist future demands. The message was clear. Cooperation brought relief, resistance brought suffering, and they had infinite patience and creativity when it came to inflicting pain. But perhaps the most insidious torture was the constant uncertainty. Alvarez never knew when the next session would begin, how long it would last, or what new horror they might devise. This unpredictability kept his nervous system in a state of constant stress, making sleep impossible and rational thought increasingly difficult. The breaking point came not with dramatic torture, but with the slow erosion of hope. Week after week, month after month, the same routine continued. No rescue came, no other prisoners arrived to share his burden. The war he'd expected to last months was clearly becoming something much larger and more complex. Sitting in his cell after another brutal interrogation session, rope burns still fresh on his wrists and shoulders, aching from hours of unnatural positioning, Alvarez faced a terrible realization. He wasn't going to be rescued anytime soon. If he was going to survive this ordeal, he'd have to find a way to adapt to circumstances that seemed designed to destroy him. The farm worker's son, who'd become a naval aviator, was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. Sometimes survival requires compromise, and sometimes the greatest courage lies not in resistance, but in finding ways to endure. The moment came on a cold morning in February 1965, 6 months into his captivity. Alvarez woke to find himself staring at the concrete ceiling of his cell, and for the first time since his capture, he couldn't remember why resistance mattered anymore. His body was failing. The rope torture had left permanent damage to his shoulders. Malnutrition had reduced him to skin and bones. Sleep deprivation had made it impossible to think clearly for more than a few minutes at a time, but it wasn't the physical breakdown that marked his breaking point. It was the moment he realized that dying for principles wouldn't help anyone. The guards had just finished another attitude adjustment session. This time, They'd tried a new approach, showing him photographs of his wife with another man. The pictures were fake, crude propaganda designed to convince him that his family had moved on without him. But in his weakened state, doubt crept in like poison. What if they were right? What if the war was already lost? What if his resistance was nothing more than stubborn pride that served no purpose except to prolong his suffering? That's when Alvarez made the hardest decision of his military career. He would survive, whatever it took. This wasn't surrender. It was adaptation. He began to understand that survival in the Hanoi Hilton required a different kind of courage than flying combat missions. It meant learning to bend without breaking, to give his captors what they needed to feel victorious while preserving his core identity. The first compromise came during his next interrogation. When they demanded he write a letter condemning American aggression, Alvarez agreed, but he wrote it in such stilted, obviously coerced language that anyone reading it would know it was forced. The interrogators were satisfied with having a signed document. Alvarez was satisfied that he'd maintained his integrity while staying alive. But survival meant more than just managing his captors. It meant finding ways to maintain his sanity in conditions designed to destroy rational thought. That's when he discovered the TAP code. The system was ingenious in its simplicity. A 5x5 grid of letters, with each letter represented by a series of taps. 1 tap, pause. 2 taps meant the letter B. 3 taps, pause. 4 taps meant the letter O. It was slow, laborious communication, but it was communication nonetheless. Alvarez first heard the tapping late one night in March 1965. At first, he thought it was pipes settling or guards walking around, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too purposeful. Someone was trying to tell him something. It took him weeks to figure out the pattern. The prisoner in the cell next to him, he'd later learn it was Navy pilot Robert Shoemaker, shot down just months after Alvarez, was patiently teaching him the code by repeating the same simple message over and over. Welcome to the Hanoi Hilton. Learning to communicate through the walls transformed Alvarez's experience of captivity. Suddenly, he wasn't alone anymore. There were other Americans in the prison, other pilots who'd been shot down and captured. They shared information about interrogation techniques, warned each other about particularly brutal guards, and most importantly, reminded each other that they were still human beings with names and histories and reasons to survive. The daily routine of survival became a form of resistance in itself. Alvarez developed a rigid schedule that gave structure to days that otherwise blended into meaningless suffering. He'd wake before dawn and immediately begin mental exercises, reciting the names of everyone in his squadron, remembering every detail of his hometown, reconstructing conversations with his wife, word by word. Physical exercise was crucial, despite his weakened condition. In the cramped confines of his cell, he'd do push-ups against the wall, isometric exercises that wouldn't attract the guards' attention, and stretching routines to counteract the damage from rope torture. Every movement was an act of defiance against captors who wanted him weak and broken. Food became an obsession, but a calculated one. Alvarez learned to eat slowly, savoring every grain of rice and making each meal last as long as possible. He'd save portions when he could, hiding bits of bread or vegetable in his clothes for later. The guards occasionally found these stashes and punished him severely, but the psychological benefit of having some control over his nutrition was worth the risk. Memory exercises became his primary defense against mental deterioration. He'd spend hours reconstructing his childhood homeroom by room, remembering the texture of his mother's hands, the smell of his father's work clothes, the sound of his wife's laugh. These memories became a fortress in his mind that the interrogators couldn't penetrate. But perhaps most importantly, he began to find small acts of rebellion that kept his spirit alive without triggering severe punishment. When guards demanded he bow, he'd bow. But he'd think about his father's dignity and refuse to let the gesture touch his soul. When they forced him to recite propaganda, he'd comply, but he'd deliberately mispronounce words or use subtle inflections that mocked the content. The arrival of other prisoners changed everything. By late 1965, the Hanoi Hilton was filling with American aviators as the war escalated. Each new arrival brought news from the outside world, updates on the war's progress, and most importantly, proof that Alvarez wasn't forgotten. Commander James Stockdale arrived in September 1965, shot down while leading a bombing mission over North Vietnam. Stockdale was a senior officer, a natural leader who immediately began organizing the American prisoners into a cohesive unit. Through the TAP Code network, he established a chain of command and a set of principles that would guide American resistance efforts. The code of conduct became their Bible. Resist to the utmost of your ability, give only name, rank, and serial number, accept no special favors, make no oral or written statements disloyal to your country. But Stockdale understood what survival school hadn't taught them. In prolonged captivity, absolute resistance meant death, and dead heroes couldn't return home to tell their stories. He developed what became known as the bounce-back philosophy. Take torture until you reach your breaking point, give them what they absolutely must have to stop the pain, then bounce back to resistance as soon as possible. It wasn't about being a perfect hero. It was about surviving with honor intact. This philosophy gave Alvarez and the other prisoners permission to be human. They could break under torture without losing their self-respect, as long as they returned to resistance when they recovered. It was a more nuanced understanding of courage than anything they'd learned in military training. The brotherhood that developed among the prisoners became their greatest source of strength. Through the TAP Code, they shared everything: family stories, jokes, detailed descriptions of favorite meals, memories of home. They celebrated birthdays and holidays together through the walls, held church services by tapping out hymns, and created a community that transcended the physical barriers of their cells. When one prisoner was taken for torture, the others would tap encouragement through the walls. When someone returned from a brutal interrogation session, they'd be welcomed back with gentle messages of support. No one was allowed to suffer alone. No one was abandoned to despair. Alvarez found himself becoming a mentor to newer prisoners, teaching them the TAP Code, sharing survival techniques, helping them understand that adaptation wasn't betrayal. The scared 26-year-old pilot, who'd been shot down in 1964, was becoming a seasoned survivor who understood that true strength sometimes meant accepting weakness. The small acts of rebellion multiplied and became more sophisticated. Prisoners would leave coded messages in their waste buckets, knowing that other Americans emptying the buckets would find them. They deliberately sabotaged propaganda filming by making faces just out of camera range or giving subtle hand signals that would identify them to American intelligence. Most importantly, they maintained their military structure and discipline. Senior officers like Stockdale gave orders through the TAP Code network. Junior officers followed those orders, and everyone understood that they were still serving their country, even in captivity. This sense of purpose gave meaning to their suffering and hope for their eventual return. By the end of 1965, Alvarez had survived longer in captivity than any American prisoner in the Vietnam War. But more than that, he'd learned to thrive in circumstances that should have destroyed him. The breaking point hadn't broken him. It had taught him that survival itself was a form of victory. By 1966, the North Vietnamese had realized they possessed something more valuable than just prisoners of war. They had propaganda gold. American pilots, especially someone like Alvarez who'd been in captivity for over a year, could be used to influence public opinion both in Vietnam and back in the United States. The first time they came for him with cameras, Alvarez thought it was just another interrogation. But when he was led into a room filled with bright lights, professional filming equipment, and a crew of Vietnamese cinematographers, he understood immediately what was happening. They weren't just trying to break him anymore. They were trying to use him. The setup was elaborate and carefully orchestrated. They'd cleaned him up beforehand, given him a fresh set of prison clothes that weren't quite as ragged as his usual outfit, and even provided a meal substantial enough to put some color back in his gaunt cheeks. The goal was to make him look healthy and well-treated, evidence that North Vietnamese captors were humane and civilized. The script they wanted him to read was a masterpiece of propaganda craftsmanship. It began with an admission of war crimes, bombing innocent civilians, destroying hospitals and schools, participating in an illegal war of aggression against the peaceful people of North Vietnam. Then, it moved to condemnation of American foreign policy and praise for the just cause of Vietnamese independence. Alvarez refused. The beating that followed was swift and brutal, but it wasn't the physical pain that bothered him most. It was the realization that his refusal meant some other prisoner would be brought in to take his place. The Vietnamese weren't going to give up on their propaganda film just because one pilot wouldn't cooperate. They tried a different approach the next day. Instead of demanding he read their script, they simply asked him to answer a few simple questions about his treatment. How was the food? Were the guards treating him well? Did he have any messages for his family back home? The questions seemed innocent enough, but Alvarez had learned to recognize the trap. Anything he said would be edited and manipulated to serve their purposes. A simple, "I'm being treated according to international law," would become evidence that North Vietnam was following the Geneva Convention. A message to his wife would be edited to make it sound like he was confessing to war crimes. But the pressure was relentless. Day after day, they brought him back to the filming room. Sometimes they'd try different approaches, friendly interrogators who spoke perfect English and claimed to understand his position. Other times, they'd bring in the rope torture specialists who could make him scream without leaving visible marks on camera. The breakthrough came when they showed him footage of other American prisoners who had participated in propaganda films. These weren't collaborators or traitors. They were good men who'd been broken by circumstances beyond their control. Seeing their hollow eyes and defeated expressions, Alvarez realized that everyone had a breaking point, and his was approaching fast. The film he finally agreed to make was a compromise that satisfied no one completely. Alvarez read a prepared statement, but his delivery was so wooden and obviously coerced that any viewer would know he was being forced to speak. He included subtle signals, a particular way of holding his hands, deliberate mispronunciations of certain words, that American intelligence would recognize as signs of duress. The Vietnamese got their propaganda film, but it was so clearly the product of torture that it probably did more harm than good to their cause. Alvarez maintained his integrity while giving his captors just enough cooperation to avoid the worst punishment. It was the kind of calculated resistance that Stockdale's bounce-back philosophy had taught him. But the propaganda war was just beginning. International delegations started visiting the prison, and Alvarez found himself being paraded before foreign journalists, peace activists, and communist sympathizers who wanted to see how well American prisoners were being treated. These visits were carefully choreographed performances. Prisoners were cleaned up, fed better meals for several days beforehand, and coached on what to say and how to behave. The visitors were shown only the best parts of the prison, met only the most cooperative prisoners, and given carefully edited versions of prison life. Alvarez learned to play his role in these performances while subtly undermining their effectiveness. When asked about his treatment, he'd praise the food while mentioning that he'd lost 40 pounds. When discussing his captors' humanity, he'd thank them for the medical care while displaying obvious, untreated injuries. The contradictions were subtle enough to avoid punishment, but clear enough for observant visitors to notice. The most humiliating propaganda event was the Hanoi March of July 1966. American prisoners were loaded onto trucks and driven through the streets of Hanoi, while thousands of civilians lined the route to jeer and throw objects. The purpose was to demonstrate North Vietnamese victory over American imperialism while giving the population a chance to vent their anger at the enemy. Alvarez sat in the back of an open truck, hands bound behind his back, while the crowd screamed at him in Vietnamese. Rocks and bottles flew through the air. Someone threw human waste that splattered across his prison uniform. The humiliation was complete and deliberate, a psychological assault designed to break his spirit as much as any torture session. But even during the march, Alvarez found ways to resist. He sat up straight, maintained eye contact with the crowd, and refused to show the fear and defeat his captors wanted to display. Some prisoners slumped in their seats or tried to hide their faces, but Alvarez stared back at his tormentors with a dignity that propaganda cameras couldn't capture. The march became international news, and the images of American prisoners being paraded through hostile crowds generated exactly the kind of controversy the North Vietnamese had hoped for. Anti-war protesters in America pointed to the march as evidence of what their government's policies were costing American servicemen. Pro-war hawks used the same images to demonstrate communist brutality and the need for stronger military action. For Alvarez, the march represented something else entirely, proof that he was still a symbol of American military power, still valuable enough to his captors that they needed to display him publicly. As long as they were using him for propaganda, they needed him alive and relatively healthy. It was a twisted form of job security, but it was something to hold on to. The psychological toll of being used as a political pawn was enormous. Every forced statement, every propaganda film, every public appearance felt like a betrayal of his military oath and his personal values. But Alvarez had learned to separate his actions from his beliefs, to understand that survival sometimes required playing roles he despised. The other prisoners understood this struggle intimately. Through the Tap Code network, they developed a system for debriefing each other after propaganda sessions, helping process the guilt and shame that came with forced cooperation. No one judged anyone else for breaking under pressure. They all knew that given enough torture, anyone could be made to say anything. What mattered wasn't perfect resistance, but maintaining your core identity despite the compromises forced upon you. Alvarez might have to read their scripts and pose for their cameras, but inside his mind, he remained Lieutenant Everett Alvarez Jr., United States Navy, serial number 0SU-59755. That identity was the one thing they couldn't take away from him, no matter what they made him do. The middle years were when hope became a luxury Alvarez couldn't afford. By 1967, he'd been in captivity for over 3 years, and the optimistic predictions of a quick American victory had proven devastatingly wrong. The war was escalating, not ending, and with each passing month, the reality of long-term imprisonment became harder to deny. The seasonal torture cycles followed a pattern that Alvarez learned to predict with grim accuracy. Winter brought increased brutality as guards sought ways to stay warm and active. The cold concrete cells became iceboxes, and prisoners shivered through nights that seemed to last forever. Frostbite was common, medical care was non-existent, and the thin prison pajamas provided no protection against temperatures that dropped well below freezing. Spring brought its own horrors. As the weather warmed, the guards' energy returned, and they seemed to take renewed pleasure in their work. This was when the most elaborate torture sessions took place, when new techniques were tested, and when prisoners who'd survived the winter found themselves facing fresh assaults on their bodies and minds. Summer was a time of stifling heat and disease. The prison became a breeding ground for dysentery, malaria, and infections that could kill a weakened man in days. The smell of human waste and rotting food became overwhelming in the humid air. Alvarez watched fellow prisoners waste away from illnesses that would have been easily treatable in the outside world. But it was autumn that brought the deepest despair. As the year wound down and another anniversary of captivity passed, prisoners were forced to confront the possibility that they might never go home. The changing leaves visible through barred windows served as a calendar marking another year lost, another year stolen from their lives. The guards' moods shifted with the seasons too, but their cruelty remained constant. Some guards were sadistic by nature, taking genuine pleasure in inflicting pain. Others were simply following orders, going through the motions of brutality with the mechanical efficiency of factory workers. But a few seemed to genuinely believe they were fighting a righteous war against American imperialism, and their conviction made them the most dangerous of all. Alvarez learned to read the subtle signs that predicted a guard's behavior on any given day. The way they walked, the tone of their voice, the speed at which they unlocked cell doors, all of these factors could mean the difference between a relatively peaceful day and hours of torture. This hypervigilance became second nature, a survival skill that would haunt him long after his release. The letters from home were perhaps the cruelest weapon in his captor's arsenal. For months at a time, no mail would arrive, leaving prisoners to wonder if their families had forgotten them or given them up for dead. Then suddenly, a batch of letters would be delivered, but they'd be months or even years old, creating a disorienting time warp that made it impossible to understand what was really happening in the outside world. Alvarez's wife, Tanji, had initially written faithfully, her letters filled with love, encouragement, and updates about their life together. But as the months turned into years, the tone began to change. She wrote about the difficulty of maintaining hope, the financial struggles of military wives whose husbands were missing in action, and the pressure from friends and family to move on with her life. The letter that broke his heart arrived in late 1968, nearly 4 years into his captivity. Tanji wrote that she'd met someone else, that she couldn't wait indefinitely for a husband who might never return, and that she was filing for divorce. The words hit him harder than any physical torture the Vietnamese had devised, but even worse than the divorce was the way his captors used the information. They would bring up his failed marriage during interrogation sessions, suggesting that if his own wife had abandoned him, what loyalty did he owe to a country that had clearly forgotten him? They painted his continued resistance as the stubborn pride of a man who had nothing left to fight for. The deaths of fellow prisoners created a different kind of torture. Alvarez watched men he'd come to know through the Tap Code network succumb to disease, maltreatment, and despair. Each death was a reminder of his own mortality and a preview of what awaited him if he couldn't find the strength to continue. Navy pilot Porter Halliburton died in early 1969 after a long battle with dysentery and malnutrition. Air Force Captain Carlisle Harris was beaten to death by guards after a failed escape attempt. Marine Captain Donald Cook died of malaria after giving his medicine rations to sicker prisoners. Each death diminished the community of Americans and left the survivors feeling more isolated and vulnerable. But the constant fear of execution was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of long-term captivity. Prisoners were regularly told they would be tried as war criminals and executed for their crimes against the Vietnamese people. Mock executions were staged, complete with blindfolds and firing squads that would fire blanks at the last second. The relief of survival was always temporary. There was no guarantee that the next execution wouldn't be real. Alvarez developed elaborate mental exercises to maintain his sanity during these endless years. He would spend hours reconstructing movies he'd seen, complete with dialogue and sound effects. He'd design and build houses in his mind, working out every detail from the foundation to the roof. He'd compose letters to family members, speeches he'd give upon his return, and detailed accounts of his captivity that he was determined to share with the world. Prayer became a constant companion, not necessarily because of deep religious conviction, but because it provided structure and hope in a world designed to crush both. He'd recite every prayer he could remember from childhood, then create new ones that addressed his specific circumstances. The act of prayer gave him a sense of connection to something larger than his immediate suffering. The Tap Code network evolved into a sophisticated communication system that kept the American prisoners connected despite their physical isolation. They shared news, passed along intelligence about guard routines, and most importantly, maintained the military chain of command that gave their resistance structure and purpose. Senior officers continued to give orders, junior officers continued to follow them, and everyone understood that they were still serving their country even in captivity. But perhaps the most important survival technique was the cultivation of small pleasures that his captors couldn't control. A shaft of sunlight streaming through his cell window became a daily celebration. The taste of a grain of sugar found in his rice ration was savored like the finest dessert. The sound of birds singing outside the prison walls reminded him that a world of beauty still existed beyond these concrete walls. As 1970 approached, marking 6 years of captivity for Alvarez, he faced a terrible realization. He was becoming institutionalized. The prison routine had become so familiar that the thought of freedom was almost frightening. He'd adapted so completely to captivity that he sometimes wondered if he'd be able to function in the outside world. This psychological dependency on his captors was perhaps their greatest victory, and recognizing it was the first step in fighting back against it. By 1970, the political landscape that had kept Alvarez imprisoned for over 6 years was finally beginning to shift. President Nixon had taken office promising to end American involvement in Vietnam, and his administration was quietly exploring diplomatic channels that had been closed for years. But for the prisoners in the Hanoi Hilton, these changes brought both hope and new forms of psychological torture. The Paris peace talks had been dragging on since 1968, creating a cruel cycle of raised expectations followed by crushing disappointment. Every few months, rumors would spread through the tap code network that a breakthrough was imminent, that prisoner exchanges were being negotiated, that freedom was just weeks away. Then the talks would stall, negotiators would walk out, and the prisoners would be forced to confront the possibility of spending even more years in captivity. Alvarez had learned not to trust hope too easily. He'd been disappointed too many times, had watched too many fellow prisoners break down when promised releases failed to materialize. But he couldn't completely suppress the growing sense that something fundamental was changing in the world outside their prison walls. The first sign came in the form of improved treatment, not dramatically better. The North Vietnamese weren't about to turn the Hanoi Hilton into an actual hotel, but the daily brutalities became less frequent. Guards who had previously beaten prisoners for minor infractions now settled for verbal abuse. The rope torture sessions, while not eliminated entirely, became less common and less severe. Food portions increased slightly, and the quality improved marginally. Instead of thin soup made from vegetable scraps, prisoners occasionally received soup with actual pieces of meat floating in it. The bread was fresher, the rice was less moldy, and sometimes there were even small portions of fruit or vegetables that hadn't completely rotted. These improvements weren't acts of kindness. They were calculated political moves. The North Vietnamese understood that if prisoner exchanges were eventually negotiated, they needed their American captives to be in presentable condition. Returning skeletal, obviously tortured prisoners would create a public relations disaster that could undermine their negotiating position. But the psychological warfare continued in more sophisticated forms. Instead of crude torture designed to break prisoners completely, the Vietnamese now employed subtle manipulation aimed at securing cooperation without leaving obvious evidence of coercion. They wanted prisoners who would return home grateful for their humane treatment and willing to speak positively about their captors. Alvarez was a prime target for this new approach. As the longest-held American prisoner, his eventual testimony would carry enormous weight with the American public and government. If they could convince him to speak favorably about his treatment, it would validate their claims of following international law and treating prisoners humanely. The offers became more tempting as the years progressed. Better living conditions, access to books and writing materials, opportunities to communicate with family members, all contingent on his willingness to make statements supporting North Vietnamese positions. The pressure was subtle but constant, wearing down his resistance through kindness rather than brutality. Fellow prisoners faced similar temptations, and not all of them were able to resist. Some wrote letters praising their captors' humanity. Others agreed to participate in propaganda films that portrayed prison life as comfortable and civilized. The Tap Code network buzzed with debates about collaboration, resistance, and the moral complexity of survival in impossible circumstances. Commander Stockdale, still the senior American officer despite years of torture and isolation, tried to maintain discipline and unity among the prisoners. But even he acknowledged that the rules of resistance had to evolve as circumstances changed. The old absolutes, never cooperate, never compromise, resist to the death, had given way to more nuanced strategies for survival with honor intact. The arrival of newer prisoners brought disturbing news about the war's progress. American public opinion had turned decisively against the conflict. Anti-war protests were massive and frequent. Congress was questioning military strategy and demanding withdrawal timelines. The prisoners realized that they were no longer symbols of American resolve. They had become embarrassing reminders of a failed policy. This shift in American attitudes created new psychological pressures. If their own country was abandoning the war, what meaning did their continued resistance have? If American leaders were negotiating withdrawal, were the prisoners' sacrifices ultimately pointless? These questions haunted men who had endured years of torture in service of what they believed was a righteous cause. The Sun Tay raid in November 1970 changed everything. American Special Forces had attempted to rescue prisoners from a camp outside Hanoi, but they arrived to find the facility empty. The prisoners had been moved months earlier. The raid failed in its immediate objective, but it sent a clear message to both the North Vietnamese and their American captives. The United States had not forgotten its prisoners and was willing to use military force to secure their release. For Alvarez, the raid was a turning point. After 6 years of captivity, it was the first concrete evidence that his government was actively working to bring him home. The knowledge that American soldiers had risked their lives in an attempt to rescue him restored a sense of connection to his country that years of propaganda had tried to sever. The North Vietnamese response to Sun Tay was swift and harsh. Prisoners were moved to more secure facilities, security was increased dramatically, and the brief period of improved treatment came to an abrupt end. But the psychological impact couldn't be reversed. The prisoners now knew that rescue was possible, that they hadn't been abandoned, that someone was fighting for their freedom. As 1971 progressed, the pace of diplomatic activity increased. The Paris peace talks resumed with new urgency, and prisoner releases became a central issue in negotiations. The North Vietnamese began using their American captives as bargaining chips, offering to release small groups in exchange for specific concessions from the United States. These partial releases created new forms of psychological torture for the remaining prisoners. Who would be chosen to go home? What criteria would determine the selection? Would cooperation with captors improve one's chances of early release? The uncertainty was agonizing for men who had already endured years of captivity. Alvarez watched as some of his fellow prisoners were selected for early release. Navy pilot Doug Hegdahl was released in 1969 as part of a small group chosen by the North Vietnamese for propaganda purposes. Air Force Captain Wesley Rumble was released in 1971 after agreeing to participate in anti-war activities. Each departure was both a celebration and a reminder of how many remained behind. The final torture sessions came in late 1972 as peace negotiations reached their climactic phase. The North Vietnamese seemed to understand that their opportunity to extract propaganda value from American prisoners was rapidly disappearing. Guards who had been relatively restrained for months suddenly returned to the brutal techniques that had defined earlier years of captivity. But these final sessions had a desperate quality that hadn't existed before. The guards seemed to know that their time was running out, that soon they would have to account for their treatment of American prisoners. The torture was savage but brief, as if they were trying to settle old scores before the game ended. Alvarez endured these final assaults with the patience of a man who could see light at the end of an 8-year tunnel. He had survived the worst they could inflict, had maintained his identity and dignity through circumstances that had broken lesser men. These last, desperate attempts to break him seemed almost pathetic compared to what he had already endured. The moment came on January 27, 1973, when the Paris Peace Accords were finally signed. Prisoners throughout the Hanoi Hilton heard the news through various channels. Guards who couldn't hide their disappointment, propaganda broadcasts that tried to spin the agreement as a North Vietnamese victory, and the subtle changes in routine that indicated something momentous had occurred. For Alvarez, the news was almost too overwhelming to process. After 3,113 days in captivity, after surviving torture, starvation, disease, and psychological warfare that had driven some men insane, he was finally going home. February 12, 1973. After 3,113 days in hell, Everett Alvarez Jr. walked across the tarmac at Gia Lam Airport in Hanoi toward a C-141 Starlifter that would carry him home. His legs shook with each step, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that this moment was actually real. The release process had been as carefully choreographed as everything else in his captivity. The North Vietnamese wanted their final propaganda victory, filming the prisoners as they boarded American aircraft to show the world their humanitarian treatment of war criminals. But for Alvarez, walking up those aircraft steps meant something far more profound than his captors could understand. He was no longer prisoner 01. He was Lieutenant Commander Everett Alvarez Jr., United States Navy, and he was going home. The flight to Clark Air Base in the Philippines passed in a surreal haze. After years of enforced silence, Alvarez found himself surrounded by American voices, doctors, debriefing officers, and fellow former prisoners who were as stunned as he was to be breathing free air. The medical examinations revealed the toll of 8.5 years, chronic malnutrition, untreated injuries that had healed incorrectly, and psychological trauma that would take years to fully understand. But the physical damage was nothing compared to the shock of returning to a world that had changed beyond recognition. The America Alvarez had left in 1964 was confident, optimistic, and united behind its military. The America he returned to in 1973 was divided, war-weary, and deeply suspicious of the military establishment that had led the country into the Vietnam quagmire. The anti-war movement had transformed American culture while he was locked away. College campuses that had been bastions of patriotism were now centers of protest. Veterans returning from Vietnam faced hostility rather than parades. The military uniform that had once been a source of pride had become a symbol of an unpopular war. Alvarez's homecoming was a media circus that he was completely unprepared for. Reporters thrust microphones in his face, asking questions about torture, collaboration, and whether he still believed the war had been worth fighting. After years of forced silence, he struggled to find words that could explain what he'd experienced to people who seemed more interested in political sound bites than human truth. The reunion with his family was bittersweet. His parents had aged dramatically during his captivity, their faces showing the strain of 8 years of uncertainty and grief. His siblings had grown up, married, and started families of their own. He was an uncle to children. February 12, 1973, marked the end of the longest captivity endured by any American prisoner of war. But for Everett Alvarez Jr., freedom came with a price that couldn't be measured in days or years. The physical scars were obvious: shoulders that never fully healed from rope torture, a body weakened by years of malnutrition and injuries that would cause pain for the rest of his life. But the invisible wounds cut deeper. Nightmares plagued his sleep. Loud noises sent him into panic attacks. The simple act of being in a crowded room triggered anxiety that made normal social interaction nearly impossible. Alvarez struggled to rebuild relationships with family members who'd become strangers during his absence. His marriage to Tanjay was already over, dissolved by the impossible strain of separation and uncertainty. The children he'd hoped to have, the career he'd planned to build, the life he'd imagined, all of it had been stolen by those 3,113 days in captivity. Yet somehow, he found the strength to move forward. Alvarez returned to active duty, eventually retiring as a Navy captain. He remarried, started a family, and built a successful career in the private sector. More importantly, he became an advocate for veterans and POWs, ensuring that their stories would be remembered and their sacrifices honored. The farm worker's son who'd dreamed of flying had endured the unendurable and emerged with his dignity intact. His survival proved that the human spirit, when tested beyond all reasonable limits, can still find ways to endure. Alvarez's story reminds us that true courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep going when everything inside you wants to quit. If you want to hear more stories of impossible survival against overwhelming odds, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell.